One of HitFilm 3 Pro's main strengths is the huge array of effects you can add to your projects. I'm Axel Wilkinson for HitFilm.com, and in this video, we are going to study the effects panel to help you get the most out of HitFilm's built-in effects. The project file that accompanies this tutorial will allow you to follow along each step of the way. HitFilm's effects come in three primary varieties. Most of the effects are 2D effects, which can be applied to a clip or layer to alter its appearance in various ways. They use this icon. The second type is 3D enabled effects, which will create their own layer and use this icon. The third is transitions, which can only be used on the editor and were discussed in an earlier tutorial. They use this icon. The effects folder also contains presets, which will be discussed later in this tutorial. There are numerous folders in the effects panel to categorize the effects so you can find them easier. We won't go through them all individually in this tutorial, but I do recommend taking some time to browse through the folders and see what they contain. The search bar at the top of the panel is also really useful if you can't remember exactly what folder an effect is stored in. If you want to look at only a specific type of effects, you can use the filter menu to filter out a specific category. So if we select 3D effects, the list is reduced to only the folders containing those type of effects, and any 2D effects in those folders are hidden. Switch back to Show All, and let's look at applying effects. Most of HitFilm's effects can be used on the editor. For 2D effects, just find the effect you want and drag it onto a clip. Open the color correction folder and drag the brightness and contrast effect onto our first clip, Turning. HitFilm opens the Controls panel to the Effects listing. This is where we can adjust the properties of any effects applied to our clip. Some effects, like this one, do not alter our footage at all by default, but we can dramatically change the tones in our footage by adjusting these sliders. Let's reduce the brightness to -20 to get some more detail in the sky. This is quite a simple effect with two straightforward properties. Open the Color Grade folder and drag the CineStyle effect onto the clip as well. This effect immediately alters our footage. Open it up and we find numerous properties that can be adjusted. The number of properties contained in each effect can vary significantly, but we use the same methods to adjust them. We can drag the sliders. For controls like the hue, which has a color wheel, we can click and drag around the wheel to rotate it. For any properties with a value, we can click and drag on the numbers, or we can click on the numbers and type in a new value. Or click on the numbers, then use the up and down arrows on your keyboard to adjust them incrementally. Some properties will just have a tick box, which we can click to toggle on and off. Take a minute or two and play with the settings in this effect. As you do, you will likely find that things can get a bit extreme when you make big adjustments, and usually smaller changes bring more pleasing results. Once we are done playing, let's right-click on the name of the effect and reset. This will restore all the properties back to their default values. Now, let's apply these same effects to the rest of our clips. Click on the Brightness and Contrast effect to select it, then Shift-click on the CineStyle. With both effects selected, right-click and copy them. On the timeline, right-click on the other Turning clip and paste here. The other two clips don't really need a brightness adjustment, so we will select and copy just the CineStyle effect, then select the other two clips by Control-clicking the second one on Windows or Command-clicking on the Mac, and paste here. Double-click the Missile Dodge Composite shot to open its timeline. The majority of your work with effects will be done in layer-based composite shots. Effects are essentially applied the same way here. Choose an effect and drag it onto a layer on the timeline. So, we could apply the CineStyle effect to our footage here, but if we do, it will only affect the video. It won't affect the missile or the smoke or the other effects. By applying the effect to the entire comp on the editor, rather than to individual layers, we can adjust everything in the scene at once, so it all matches. You will notice some effects labeled Layer Only. These effects can only be used in a comp, not in the editor. The reason for this is that these effects contain properties which link to other layers, so they need to be on a layered timeline to function. When you are in a composite shot, you can access the controls for the effects either in the controls panel or on the timeline. The timeline controls also allow you to view any keyframes that are associated with a specific property. We have a number of things already set up in this composite shot, so let's briefly look at how it is put together, then we will examine the effects being used in greater detail. At the bottom, we have our footage, which is still a 2D layer. These 3D layers require a camera, which we have next. Then we have our missile, which is a 3D model, and a gunfire effect is used to create the missile burn. A particle simulator gives us our smoke. Then we have our main light, used to illuminate and shadow the missile and smoke so they match the scene better, and a second light to create a yellow glow around our missile burn. We have a plane set up to catch the shadow, and we have a point, one point, which controls the movement of all of these components. There are two main effects being used here, though, the gunfire and the particle simulator. Let's turn those layers off using the eyeball and reconstruct them to see what we can learn. Let's also turn off the lights and the shadow plane for now, since we won't be getting into those in this video. As was mentioned, 3D-enabled effects, with this small 3D cube in their icon, will create their own layer when used. In the Particles and Simulation folder, find the Gunfire effect and drag it onto the timeline. This effect is called Gunfire, but we are going to use it to create our flaming rocket engine. Don't feel limited to using effects only for what their name implies. Once added, open the controls and we can edit this effect. Let's start by adjusting the appearance a bit to get closer to the look we are after. We can select from a variety of built-in textures from this menu. You can also import your own custom textures, but we won't get into that here. Choose the Tommy Gun Daylight texture from the menu, then set the color to 255, 180, 120. You don't need to copy those values exactly, you can use a different color if you prefer. Now we need to position the effect. Set the playhead at 2 seconds so the missile is in frame, and parent the gunfire layer to the animation point. Open the transform properties for the gunfire and zero out all three position values. Then set the scale to 70%. We have two sets of controls for the shape, core flare and side flares. In the core flare, reduce the length to 166 and the radius to 50. This makes the side flares much more evident surrounding the core. We don't need the side flares here, so in their controls, disable the active state. Our missile burn is looking a bit puny though, isn't it? We can increase the power by adding more particles into the effect. There are two stages of particles used in the gunfire, but we just need to increase the primary to 130. The length taper lets us taper the general shape of the effect toward either end. Set it to 0 so it tapers away from the missile. We still need to adjust the alignment of this effect a bit more, so let's go back to the transform controls. In the orientation, rotate the effect 90 degrees on the y-axis to align it with the missile. And notice that even though this is a 2D layer, it still has full 3D transform controls. This is because any effects that are 3D enabled are actually created in 3D. But by default, HitFilm 3 Pro flattens them into a 2D layer, kind of like rendering them into a video before it displays them on the timeline. This allows us to add other 2D effects to the layer. But if we are working in a 3D composite and would rather keep full 3D interactivity for the effect, we can easily switch the layer to a 3D plane or 3D unrolled. Drag the gunfire layer down below the Sidewinder, and because it's 2D, it renders behind the missile. Switch the gunfire layer to 3D unrolled, and now it is in the same 3D space as the missile and accurately interacts with it. Move the layer back to where it was, and nothing changes on the viewer since we didn't change its 3D position. Since our effect is parented to a point that's moving through 3D space, the flash naturally gets farther away and stays in place relative to the missile as it moves. So, that's our missile burn taken care of. Now we need to add the smoke. As we saw with the gunfire effect, HitFilm makes it easy to adjust the appearance of an effect to get the exact results you want. but sometimes it can take some time to get things dialed in, and it would be nice to have a shortcut to the finished result. This is where the preset system in HitFilm comes into play. HitFilm 3 Pro installs with dozens of presets, which enable you to instantly create specific 3D effects or apply different grading looks to your footage with 2D effects. We can create a new preset of the rocket engine effect we just created by right-clicking on the layer and choosing Create 3D Preset. Name it Rocket Engine and select the 3D Effects Gunfire folder. Click Save, and now we can find the preset in the Gunfire folder anytime we need it in any project we create. Let's now use an existing preset to create the smoke we need. Open Presets, 3D Effects, Particle Simulator, find the Missile Smoke preset and drag it onto the timeline. Convert the layer to 3D. With our Gunfire effect, we parented the layer to our animation point to control its movement. But we can't do that here because we want the smoke to stay in place once it is created. We don't want the whole layer to move, we just want the emitter to move and create smoke as it goes. So, in the controls, we will open the Emitters, Emitter Shape, and find the Attach to Layer property. Select our animation point here, and we can thus link the emitter, which creates the particles, to our point. You will find that this technique, where we control an effect's position using another layer, is used frequently in various HitFilm effects. Even though we started with a preset, we still have full control over adjusting the specific settings used in our effect, so we can make a couple of adjustments so it better fits our scene. To make the smoke just a bit thicker, we will open the Particle Systems, Particle System General controls, and increase the particles per second to 200. When you look at the number of controls available in a particle effect, and how quickly we were able to dial this smoke in, you can see the advantage of working with presets. It's not identical to my original smoke. I left out a couple of more advanced adjustments I made in the lifetime panel, but these results are still quite close to my original effect. We're going to make a couple more adjustments now so our effects work better with our lighting setup. Don't worry if you don't fully understand these next couple of steps. You will learn more about lighting and these material properties in a later tutorial. Open the materials for our smoke layer and enable Cast Shadows and Billboarded Lights. Then select the Gunfire effect and in its materials, disable Illuminated. Now turn the lights and our shadow plane on and gaze in wonder on the effects you just created. There are a couple of other points I'd like to cover if you switch back to the editor timeline. First of all, we know that 3D enabled effects will create a new layer in a comp, but what happens if you use them on the editor? Well, drag the Gunfire effect onto the editor, and you can see it creates its own clip. Not only that, but it automatically creates a composite shot, so you are able to access the 3D abilities of that effect. The second point involves creating presets of grading effects. Select our first timeline clip and open the effects controls. If you want to create a grading preset, rather than selecting the layer, select the specific effects that you want to include in the preset, then right-click and choose Create Preset. This process is the same on both the editor timeline and in composite shots. To apply this, or any 2D preset, drag it onto a clip or layer just like you would drag an individual effect, and all the effects contained in the preset will be applied. So, now you should understand the basics of applying and adjusting effects in your projects. In our next video, we will learn about keyframing and animating movement and other changes in our layers and effects over time. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you then.